the party?
Yeah, good things happen. Let me hear.
Too late.
Okay, so I missed the story. Oh, well. Fake it. So nice to see you. Not only you on, but I see you. I see every single person. This is beautiful. Shalom is so nice. I see you and Rivka and Bella and Chava. This is beautiful. A cohort of friends. So we can see everyone's faces. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. All right. Well, sorry I missed the story. I guess that's what happens when you're late. Let's say our blessing. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Ha'olam Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim V'nasan Lanu Es Toraso Baruch Atah Adonai Nosein HaTorah Shema Israel Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. All right. Well, thank you for joining. Sorry, I missed the story. I'm going to start with the two questions that were raised. I think one by Rivka, one by Chava. So you're here. I remember who asked this question on my phone in front of me. I think Rivka asked the question about the Tehillim at night. And Chava asked about Rosh Hashanah. So thank you for the questions. Those are all such obvious questions anyone can ask. Thank you for raising them. So in terms of the idea of the Psalms at night, the Tehillim, the Psalms, now we know it's probably been said more than once that we do not say Psalms at night until the Jewish midnight, meaning from a half an hour after sunset until the Jewish midnight, which is nowadays about 10 to 1. In the summer, that's usually when it is, 12:52, 12:54, 12:56, 12:53, fluctuates around that time. We do not say Psalms, do not say Tehillim. In the winter, Jewish midnight's more like about 12-ish. 11:52, 11:55, until about 12, we do not say Psalms. Why? It's actually a Kabbalistic reason why, which might sound a little surprising. But the reason is because nighttime, or the first portion of the night, because the night is divided into 3 portions. The first portion of the night, that portion of the night until Jewish midnight, is considered the time when the external forces, what we would call the forces of the evil, are getting their sustenance. Now, what would happen if a Jew says Psalms then? Or really, it's not only Psalms, by the way, it's any reading of the written Torah alone, meaning any reading of the written Torah without any commentary or explanation. So if you were learning Chumash, for example, if you were learning the Torah, and you read the Torah with Rashi, classical commentator, so you're reading it with commentary, that's fine. But if you just read the verses of Torah themselves, or of any of the prophets or any of the writings, it would be the exact same problem as Tehillim. It doesn't usually come up because people don't do that generally. Meaning if someone is reading it, one is generally reading it with commentary. One is studying it, and therefore there's a commentary. So it's not an issue, then it's the studying of Torah. But if it's just the reading of Torah, any of the written Torah, the 5 books of Torah, any of the prophets or any of the writings, this force specifically, we're told, could remove the flow of life that the external forces, the forces of evil, are receiving during these hours. Meaning it's the written Torah. It's you're going all the way to the top. Purely, solely, low, unadulterated, no additives, no preservatives, nothing, just the words of written Torah themselves. So it's a very powerful, powerful force, and it's so powerful, it could take away It can remove the sustenance of the evil forces. So you could say, oh, that's cool. That's great. Like, who doesn't want to remove the sustenance of the evil forces? But we can't do it that way. Because that's sort of like, it's not because we created a vessel of our Torah study or acts of commandments which are containing energy so they can't be given to the evil forces. This is sort of like just sort of cutting them off in a way that's considered like not fair. And as such, they could lash back because we're like taking away their feeding time when officially it's their right. And therefore we're told we don't say Psalms then, or for that matter, read any of the written Torah then during those hours of their feeding. So we could do it all day long, except those hours. Like nowadays, it would be from about, I would say about 9 to 1, 10, 11, 12, 1. Those like 4 hours out of the 24, that 1/6 of the day, we don't do it. Unless, of course, it's a crisis. If someone is very ill or there's some tremendous emergency, because of course we know the tremendous value of Psalms, of Tehillim, in drawing down God's kindness and compassion. And then we're told that emergency overweighs this other issue, and we do it anyway. But otherwise, in a normative state, for normative Psalms, we don't do it for this reason, which is very, very Kabbalistic, but very, very real. And that's why we don't do it. Any questions on that? Okay, so Chava asked a simpler question. Also a very fundamental question. In Israel, holidays are generally 1 day. And outside Israel, in what we call the diaspora, there are 2. Except for Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is 2 days in Israel and 2 days outside of Israel. Yom Kippur is 1 day everywhere. It's 1 day. Sukkot, in Israel, there's 1 holiday and then the intermediate days and then another holiday. Outside Israel, it's 2 holidays, then the intermediate days, and then 2 holidays. And the same thing with Passover. 1 holiday, intermediate days, and 1 holiday, 1 holy day. And outside Israel, 2 holy days, intermediate days, and 2 holy days. And the festival of the giving of the Torah, Shavuot, in Israel is 1 day, and outside Israel is 2 days. So we see then Pesach, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, 1 holy day in Israel, 2 holy days outside Israel. But Rosh Hashanah is 2 days in Israel and 2 days outside of Israel. And the question is why? So the answer is because to understand the answer, we have to understand why it's outside of Israel 2 days and inside Israel 1. Each of these holidays that we have these holy days, 1 in Israel and 2 outside Israel. And the reason is going back to the original way the holidays were determined. Meaning nowadays, if you want to know what day is a holiday, you open up your Jewish calendar, or you probably open up your phone and go to your Jewish calendar app. And if you wanted to know when your grandson's bar mitzvah is going to be in 13 years and what day it's going to fall out, no problem. You go on the calendar. And you want to know, the secular date of your grandmother's birthday, you want to know the Jewish date, no problem. You go on the calendar. It's very simple. We have a calendar. That calendar was instituted around the time, not precisely, but we're going to say roughly around the same era, somewhat later then, shortly after the destruction of the Second Temple. But it wasn't exactly the day after the destruction of the Second Temple, but in the era after, in the era following. Well, the Jews were still in Israel, and therefore the rabbis were still in Israel, and therefore there was a very special thing called, what we call in Hebrew, smicha. Smicha, which means literally to lean, to offer the offering, they would lean on the head of the animal. And to pass over the mantle of Torah authority, they would put their hands and lean, one rabbi transferring the authority to the next. And this was an unbroken chain of smicha, of rabbinical authority. And part of the authority of the rabbis was to adjudicate the calendar, because the calendar was determined on a monthly basis originally. There was no concept of, you're 2 years old, you're bar mitzvah in 13 years, I'll tell you exactly when it's going to fall out. No such concept, because every month it was determined. Every month it was determined, is this a month of 29 days? Is this a month of 30 days? Is it we're going to have a leap year this year? We're not going to have a leap year this year. Every month it was determined. It was determined based on the eyewitness sighting of the new moon. And there are numerous laws surrounding the eyewitness sighting of the new moon. And they have people on the hilltops and people looking, and people that would run to Jerusalem and would tell the highest tribunal court, the Sanhedrin, that they saw the moon. And they had the rabbis that would cross-examine exactly the size and the color and the shape and the time to determine this was a true witness. And we needed 2 such witnesses to determine that, yes, we have the new moon. And now our month can begin. Now, of course, every month has either 29 or 30 days. There was never a day of 31 month, a month of 31 days. But within the 29 or 30 days, it was really determined by the witnesses, which means every month. We don't know until it happens. And this continued unbrokenly from when God gave us the commandment of the new moon, which was the commandment that Moses still received when they were in Egypt, until after the destruction of the temple. And when the rabbis then saw, and they said, wait a minute, this situation is ending. We could see it happening. We are going to ultimately be completely exiled. The Jews are going to be dispersed from Israel. And when every Jew is dispersed from Israel, we will no longer have the true smicha, the true rabbi to rabbi, to rabbi to rabbi, unbroken chain, which means we will no longer have rabbis that have the authority to adjudicate the calendar. What are we going to do? And with absolute brilliance, they said, we have to create a calendar. We have to create a calendar that will last until the coming of redemption. And they did so. And they have a calendar. It's a 19-year cycle calendar that the Jewish people have been following ever since. Every 19 years, the calendar recycles. And through the brilliance of this 19-year calendar, which is a brilliance obviously beyond our comprehension of all the things they took into account, we always have, which is of course a very important significance based on a biblical verse, the coming together of the lunar and the solar months. Meaning the Christian calendar is purely solar. The Islamic calendar is purely lunar. The Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar, but we need to stay abreast of the solar seasons. And therefore, we can never let the lunar calendar sort of go on its own, because if we do so, ultimately we'll come completely out of whack with the solar, and we'll eventually celebrate Passover in the summer, in the fall, in the winter. And there's a biblical command that Passover always be in the springtime. And therefore, we always have to make sure that the lunar months match the solar seasons. And that was the brilliance of the calendar they devised to always keep it abreast. So, for all my lifetime, and for the past almost 1900 some years, we've been following this calendar designed by the sages of that time. But originally, there was no calendar. It was based on the sighting of the eyewitnesses. When would the new month be? See how it's a long answer. And therefore, we could have a problem, Rosh Hashanah. Because any other holiday, which again, biblically would be the holiday of Shavuos and the holiday of Sukkot, because they're the midpoint of the month. right? They're in the 15th. Whenever the sages determined if it was the new moon, you had roughly 2 weeks to spread the news, to make sure that everybody knew the date, which date was the first, and therefore which date would be the holiday of Sukkot or the holiday of Pesach, of Passover. Shavuot was a different calculation. It was counted from the Exodus, so Shavuot has nothing to do with any of this. But we make it also 2 days, so there shouldn't be a differentiation and it shouldn't be slighted and seem less than the other holidays. But for Passover and for Sukkot, to know when is the 15th of the month, you need to know when is the 1st of the month. And if you lived in Israel, well, the sages had 2 weeks to let you know the news, and that's long enough. Israel's not such a big country. The messengers could go all over Israel way before 2 weeks. So everyone in Israel would know when to celebrate Passover or Sukkot. But already, once people lived outside of Israel, the question is, would the messengers of the sages get there on time? Obviously, some places wouldn't be a problem, and some places will be a problem. So to make it simple, outside Israel, let's play it safe, because again, it's a question of which of 2 days. Is this a month of 29 days or a month of 30 days? So there will be the question then of when is the holiday, this day or this day? So to be safe, we're doing it 2 days. And that's what we did for Shavuot. For Sukkot, that's what we did for Passover, Pesach. And for Shavuot, we did it the same way, even though really it's a counting of the days, not to differentiate. But for Rosh Hashanah, the holiday is on Rosh Chodesh. The first day of the month is Rosh Hashanah. And therefore, even in Israel, you wouldn't know. You live in the Galil, you live in Tzfat, you live in Beersheba, you're not going to know on time if it's Rosh Hashanah or not. So therefore, even in Israel, Rosh Hashanah was 2 days. Now, Kabbalistically, and really even not Kabbalistically, according to the sages, so this is also found in the Talmud, we say the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah are really like one long day. And the 2 days create one energy in a sense, which is why, if you remember the law, that on the second night of Rosh Hashanah, in connection with lighting the candles, what do we have to do? Second night of Rosh Hashanah, this is a quiz. What do we do when we light the candles? What do we have to have on the table?
Pre-existing flame?
Well, pre-existing flame is for every holiday. But what do we have uniquely for Rosh Hashanah?
Shakianu.
A Shakianu, a new fruit, right? We have the new fruit by the candle lighting, the new fruit by the Kiddush. Why? Because since our sages say that spiritually the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah are like one long day, it's a for a question, I'm making the blessing of Shakianu, because Shakianu means we have now something new. But what's new when this is really one long 48-hour day? It's nothing new. It's a continuation of the first half of this 48-hour day. So therefore, to create something new, we have the new fruit. It's interesting. Yesterday, I had the very, very, very special privilege of being by my son in Springfield with the completion of a Torah scroll. And to honor the Torah scroll, could you imagine something as spectacular as a Torah scroll? My son, as the recipient of the Torah scroll, Chabad of Springfield, of course, was supposed to make the blessing Shakianu. But again, since, of course he should, I mean, no question, it's definitely a Shakianu, but technically it's a little, whatever. Nowadays, we're a little nervous on all these blessings. So he makes the blessing of Shakianu on the Torah scroll, and then he has a new fruit, just to cover that base. So he makes a big, loud blessing of Shakianu, and then he makes a quiet blessing on the new fruit, eats the fruit, and his son says quite loudly, his 4-year-old, "What are you eating? What is that?" But that was the point. Of course it's a Shakianu. What could be a bigger Shakianu than a Torah scroll? But again, just in case, have the new fruit. So on the second half, perhaps, of the one long day of Rosh Hashanah, we want to make the Shakianu blessing, but we have the new fruit. So that is the answer to Chava's question. There are a lot of details I had to tell you to give you a complete answer, because I would never want to have an incomplete answer. Any questions on any of those details? Because that pulled in a lot of different ideas in Jewish law and Jewish history. Any questions? Okay. Well, I am so grateful that Rivka and Chava took me up on my offer of questioning, of asking such basic questions on you know, Judaism that we encounter every day, like not being allowed to say the Psalms at night, or why is Rosh Hashanah the only holiday in Israel, which is 2 days. So thank you so much for asking. Now you're very educated people, because many Orthodox people would not know the answer to either question. So no, you are supremely educated, which is great, and you deserve it. And please keep the questions coming, because I would want that your questions are answered. All right, so we will continue with the Tanya that we are studying. And for some reason, this is not on the right page, but let me venture to guess where we were. Not here. Does someone remember exactly where we were up to? Because now I'm looking at it and my mind is a blur. I think it has something to do with going to Springfield over the weekend. I think it must have been so clear to me where it was that I did not write it down. I believe I finished the chapter, but I don't want to say completely.
I think you said you finished a chapter and it'll be easy to remember where you are because of
I
that.
think so too. I actually think so too. I believe so too. And I'm trying to remember if this was chapter 4 or 5. I think it was chapter 5. Did I speak about the idea of if someone sinned with such a grievous sin? I actually remember exactly saying the same thing, Simcha. Oh, I finished the chapter. I'll for sure remember. You see, I think my brain works. It really doesn't. Did I explain the idea of someone who created a tremendous sin, why he would not die as biblically he's supposed to?
I don't remember you
I don't
saying.
remember explaining that either.
Yeah.
So I bet I finished chapter 4. So if I had my phone, I could check quickly on YouTube. But I don't believe I did that either. So I believe we're up to chapter 5. Okay. But I do somehow remember the. Okay, I'm going to start. Chava's supposed to remember because last week I remember Chava saying that I had done the whole thing. Chava, you're supposed to remember where we're up to. Because last week you did, and that was from weeks ago.
Yes.
Okay, okay.
I can quickly listen to the last portion
Okay.
on YouTube.
Yeah, well, actually, you could just even look at the title of it. The title of it would say what we did. Did it say we did chapter 5 or chapter 6? This is horrible. Look at me. Somehow I think we did a chapter, but I don't remember saying this. Okay, I was going to check out the title of the last class on YouTube because on the title I write what we learned. So Chava's going to tell me what chapter it says we did. In the interim, I'm going to review while Chava's checking. So in chapter 5, which is what I think we did last week, we speak about the idea. Maybe we didn't. Remember we said that when one sins, there are two energies of God that are pulled down, right? We said God has a fundamental name of 4 letters, a yud and a hey and a vav and a hey, right? And we said when we sin, we harm God's name. We pull down the 2 heys. And we explained that these letters refer to God's energies. The first hay is God's intellect, called in the Hebrew bina, and the final hay is God's sovereignty, called in the Hebrew malchut or malchus. And the reason that we pull down these energies, we said, is because our soul is roped into God's energy. And there was a verse that we brought to prove this where it says Jacob is the rope of his inheritance. And we said that the rope between us and God are the 613 strands, reflecting the 613 commandments. And we said every time we sin, okay, thank you. So we complete, of course, it was a very simple thing because we finished a chapter. We just had to remember which chapter we finished. So we finished chapter 4, and now we're beginning chapter 5, which is just what I was explaining. So we're going to keep going. Thank you, Chava. So every time we sin, if it's a regular transgression, there snaps a little strand, so to speak, of this rope. If it was a very grave transgression, slice, there goes the whole bond between us and God. Because we explained that there's a special relationship between God and the soul. We explained that the Jew is unique in all of creation because the Jew, what defines a Jew? A godly soul. A godly soul is not really creation. It's a bit of creator, a bit of creation. And as such, the very breath of God, the depth of God is flowing into the soul, unless there's a barrier. What could block God? The only thing that can block God is the sin of a Jew. As it says, your sins separate. Your sins create barriers between you and God. If you remember, we discussed last week this idea of the forces of evil. You might view it as personalized, your evil inclination. You might view it as the big forces out there. It's all part and parcel of the same thing that are trying to instigate you to sin. Every one of us, all day long, is being tormented. Great question. I'm just going to finish. I'm going to answer that. Tormented by these forces that are trying to get us to sin. Why do they want to get us to sin? Because when they get us to sin, they get to take in all those forces that are supposed to go to our soul, but your sins block you. And since they created the blockage, they get the goods, which is why they're trying to create the blockage. So someone just asked a very smart question. Well, what if you don't know you're sinning? What if you don't know you're a Jew? What if you don't know this is what God commanded? How many millions of Jews don't know they're a Jew, or don't know what God commanded, or don't know the commandments are still relevant today, or don't understand what it means God, and what it means a godly soul, and what it means a Jew, and what it means a commandment? That's the majority of the Jewish world today. So also those people, the majority of our people, are also being tempted to sin. The difference between a Jew who on one level or another doesn't know and a Jew who does know is in terms of, does the Jew deserve punishment? That's the only difference. It does not remove the natural consequence for sin. Meaning, there's a very important question that was raised, so I'm going to try to say that a little more clearly. Let's say there's this beautiful, wonderful Jew that has no clue they're Jewish. Or they know they're Jewish, but they don't know it's Yom Kippur. Or they know it's Yom Kippur, but they don't know you're actually not allowed to eat or drink on Yom Kippur. Or they know that, but they don't know what that means. They don't know what God means. They don't know what being a Jew means. They don't know what a commandment means. They don't know what Yom Kippur means. So in essence, they don't know. And such a Jew eats or drinks on Yom Kippur, one of the gravest offenses. Will they ever be punished? No, of course not. They're clueless. But did what they do have significant consequence? Yes. All the consequences apply. The only thing that is different between that Jew and a Jew that knows is, can one punish? You can't punish. How can you punish someone that doesn't know? But is there a blockage between them and godly flow? Absolutely. Does the forces of evil suck it all in? Absolutely. But would they be punished? No. But would they suffer consequence? Yes. If a person was eating something that was poisonous, would we say it's a punishment if they become ill from the poison? No, it's what happens when you eat something poisonous. You ate food that was contaminated. You didn't know it was contaminated. You ate the food. You got sick. Is there a punishment going on? Well, that's what happens when you eat contaminated food. So in essence, that's what happens when a Jew transgresses God's will. There's a natural consequence for transgressing God's will. That happens if you know or if you don't know. But is there an overlay additionally of punishment for transgressing God's will? This is God's will and you went against it? No. But you ate contaminated food so you feel sick? Yes. Does a Jewish marriage suffer if there's no mikvah? Yes. Do Jewish children suffer if they're not born with mikvah? Yes. Is God punishing you for that to happen? No, that just means you're Jewish, and as such, things aren't flowing the way they're supposed to. I guess I'm thinking of mikvah because I had this beautiful experience yesterday of taking a woman significantly past menopause to mikvah. It was a very beautiful experience. So I did it in Springfield, so it was yesterday. And my son, beyond, thank God, finishing the Torah scroll, also built a beautiful mikvah, a beautiful ritual bath adjoining his house. You'd never know it from the house, but it's beautiful, beautiful spa-like mikvah there. If you're ever looking for a spa-like mikvah, go to Springfield. And it was so special that this woman, she told me many years ago, she heard a sermon of a rabbi who inspired her every year to take on one new mitzvah. One a year, forever. And this year she said her mitzvah was going to be going into the mikvah. For a woman who's after menopause, you go once and you're good forever. So it was a very, very, very significant act. And also, as we know, when one goes to mikvah, it brings tremendous blessings to the marriage and to the children. And if a child was born without the blessings of the mikvah, when a mother later goes to mikvah, this retroactively brings those blessings to the child. So she has a child, and she really wants that child to marry a Jew. And for that reason, she was very, very motivated to go to mikvah. And it was a very beautiful privilege to take her because besides being somewhat old, elderly, not tremendously, but terrified of water. So it was very, very, very challenging. But she stuck strong and she did it because she wanted to do this extra mitzvah for God. And she wanted to bring down these tremendous blessings for a child. So that's why my mind went in that direction. But in any case, if one doesn't eat the way God wants for a Jewish body, is there going to be problems? Of course. Is that a punishment? Not at all. That's just a natural consequence. So therefore, yes, every Jew, Jews that don't know they're Jewish, Jews that are ultra observant, for everyone, there is the consequence of the blockage created by sin, the barriers created by sin. But the only difference again is one punished additionally for knowingly transgressing God's will, or is there no punishment because there was no knowing transgression of God's will? But in either case, there's a blockage. And that blockage, that flow of energy coming from the two hays, the upper hay, God's intellect, and the lower hay, God's sovereignty, and most specifically from the lower hay, is that flow of energy to the soul, that special flow of God's divine breath that is uniquely and only for the Jewish soul, that's blocked. And because that's blocked, that's the reason why we're told that someone who sins with a very grievous sin, a sin that we would call a sin of excommunication or excision of the soul, meaning a sin for which God says, that's it. We're not snapping a strand, we're cutting the whole rope. If that whole rope is sliced, the person's going to die. And that's why it said for certain grievous sins, you're going to die before age 50. Or for other types of sins, you're going to die before age 60. Why is a person dying? Because the rope was severed. Since the rope was severed, it's not just a blockage. It's not just a snapping a strand so the rope becomes weaker and the life force becomes less. It's severing the rope. Now there's nothing coming to you at all. Well, if there's no life force coming, how do you survive? So, based on the severity of the transgression, there's some residual energy which enables your soul to stay alive in your body until 50 or until 60 in a very, very weakened state, after which, done. No more life force coming, cut off. No more life force of the soul in the body, no more life of the soul in the body, no more life for the body, otherwise known as death. Meaning the physical body ultimately receives its life from the energy of the soul. So if the soul is not being energized, ultimately the physical body is not going to be alive. And that's why for very grievous sins, this cutting the rope, which means cutting the channel of life for the soul, ultimately would mean death for the body. And that's why for certain sins, the person died. Not by sword, not by strangulation, by a lack of life. Because there's no life for the soul, there's no life for the body, there's no life. Now we raise the question that nowadays people who officially have done such sins, not meaning the Jew that doesn't know even, but people that knowingly have done this and have received this consequence, continue to live. Remember, we raised that question at the beginning of chapter 4. And we said, how are they still alive? If that rope got severed, and therefore the life force stopped, and therefore the soul is not being fed, well, then the body dies. So why nowadays does the body not die? So I'll answer that question in a minute. So the answer would be because nowadays means post-destruction of the Second Temple. So for roughly the past 1900 years, there has been a different option for a Jew to live. And that different option will be that the Jew lives off the forces of evil. Until that point of time, that option didn't exist. And therefore, if a Jew's rope was severed, ultimately his life source would end. And therefore he would die. But when the Jews fell, in other words, this fact of the Jews living after suffering such a sin is not we've attained a higher level. It's really, we fall into a lower level. We fall into such a level that we could be fed off the forces of evil. And that's how such Jews now could choose. Again, it's not a conscious choice. Do I want to live off the force of godliness and die? Or do I want to live off the force of evil? It's the de facto option of a Jew who has sinned so severely that instead of dying, they now have an option to live of the forces of evil. What type of sin would that be? So it would be, for example, I mean, there's lots of different ones. I don't want to give a legal answer now, but because it's a little unclear. For some things, it would actually be punishment by the court. But I believe it would be certain forbidden relationships. It would be eating leaven on Passover, eating on Yom Kippur. I believe it would be someone who does not have a circumcision. These, I believe, are examples of transgressions that we're told are so significant that they would receive this divine consequence. But I will check out to be very careful, because again, I'm not a rabbi, and therefore I don't want to say clearly if something is or isn't along these lines, because again, it's a little complex. I mean, there are really three categories for which one will receive the death penalty. The ones we're talking about is either what's called technically kares, excision of the soul, or death by the divine court. There's also death by the human court. That's why I just want to make sure that the ones I'm saying, I know all of those are death. I want to make sure what I gave were examples of death in these two spiritual, divine ways. Any other questions on any of this?
So question, like what you explaining, a couple questions. Yes, one question would be that in Torah, it says explicitly for what transgressions is death, right? It has like a direct text.
Absolutely.
So would you say that that's aligned with what you're saying?
So that's what I'm saying, that I want to check. If, in other words, what you're saying, which is actually another question, which might be true, it might not, and I don't want to say because we're talking about something very severe. What Chava's raising is, let's say it clearly says, for this transgression, the tribunal court will bring to death. The only court that could bring to death was the Supreme Court of 71 sages. So for an example, if someone practices witchcraft, now to be culpable of sentencing for the court's death, there has to be witnesses and warnings. So if somebody with two witnesses, two kosher witnesses and warnings, practice witchcraft, the punishment is death. If someone did so, but there's no divine court, there's no human Supreme Court of 71 sages to give that punishment, would they then be transferred to this punishment? I'm not 100% sure. It does, and I will try to find out for you. It does say that for any sentencing, and the reason I'm not 100% sure, I'm going to explain now. It does say that for any sentencing, if the humans can't do it, God will. And the reason that's brought out is because it's supremely difficult for the Jewish Supreme Court to bring someone to the death sentence. It says actually that if a court caused a death sentence once in 70 years, they'd be considered like a bloodthirsty court because it's so difficult. So the question is then raised, but wait a minute, God. Like, for example, let's say someone murdered. We know they murdered, but they did not have two kosher witnesses and two kosher warnings. Human court can do nothing to them. Everyone knows they murdered. Human court can do nothing to them. Do they then get the divine court's death? We're told yes. God says, don't worry. You have to follow the laws. I only want the death sentence to be executed when there is not 99.999% certainty. No DNA samplings here. Only 100% certainty. So what happens to everyone else? I'll take care of him. That's what God tells us. I, God, will execute the punishment that I'm not allowing the human court to execute, because I only allow the human court to execute death sentence when it's 100% certainty with 2 kosher witnesses, 2 kosher warnings. And it's pretty rare to have 2 kosher witnesses and 2 kosher warnings before many of these transgressions. So because that's the case, and because God says, I will punish anyone you cannot punish, it seems to imply that all of those death sentences that are enumerated in Torah would ultimately fall into this category. But I'm not 100% sure, and therefore I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to look it up. Any other questions? Chava had a few, she said.
I want to give opportunity others to ask their questions.
Sure. Anyone else? Anyone else have any questions on this? I know I put out a lot of information in a short amount of time. Okay. Let me just check
Can you
quickly.
explain again, living off the bad forces. I always thought, even with Carrie's, which I always learned was forbidden sexual relation, like adultery. And I just read that it is about the circumcision. Like if you don't circumcise your child, well, one said if you don't circumcise your child, the other one said if the male doesn't accept upon his, I guess that means to circumcise his child. But I always thought also that nowadays, since the destruction, you can do tshuva for even anything, and that.
True, we're going to get to that. We didn't get to that point. So what Simcha is saying is, in a sense, our messed up situation has an advantage. What do I mean by messed up situation? In the times of the temple, if a person sinned such a sin for which their soul was cut off, they died. Done, they died. Some died on the spot. Some died at the age of, up to the age of 50, up to the age of 60. They physically died. Their soul was not receiving life. The soul didn't have life, therefore the body didn't have life, therefore they died. Nowadays, we said, no, they wouldn't die. They would instead live off the force of evil. So that's a bit of a messed up situation. In biblical times and in the times of the temple, a Jew doesn't have the ability to live off evil. That's why they died. Because we fell so low, we could live off evil. But Simcha is saying, since we continue to live off the force of evil, there could be an option that didn't exist in the biblical or temple times, which is for the Jew to repent because he's still alive. And repentance only takes place when you're alive. And she's right. And that is the silver lining of the situation, that because the Jew is still alive through the force of evil, there could still be the possibility of repentance. And that couldn't happen if the person already passed away. Any other questions? Because I want to make sure we all remember where we are. I just want to clear, I think we're done the chapter. I just want to skim it inside for a second to make sure I didn't miss any critical point. Yep. We finished chapter 5. If my brain doesn't work next week, there is someone out there who's going to remember. Every one of you wants to be that someone. All right. So I know we're all going to remember. And now let's learn a little bit of the laws of the Shabbos. Okay, we actually mentioned this law last week. I do remember it came up. Came up in answering a question, but it's a little bit broader, the answer, than what we did. If you remember last week, I believe it was Simcha, someone raised the issue of making the Kiddush on bread. If they didn't have wine available, they couldn't drink wine, right? So we touched on that. So the real best way to do Kiddush, as I did mention last week in response to Simcha's question, was on wine. If you just want to do it the best way God wants, on wine. And within wine, it's nice to have a nice wine. Because again, this is honoring the Sabbath in its entrance with Kiddush, in its exit with Havdalah. So we don't just want like, the cheapest bottle on the shelf. We would actually like a nice wine. And within wine itself, there are varying levels. Uncooked wine is considered more special. Red wine is considered more special. There are varying levels of how our sages would mark a better wine. But at least wine. But if for whatever reason a person could not have wine, he doesn't have wine, there's not enough wine, or he can't tolerate wine, he's allowed, both at night and by day, as we said last week, to make the Kiddush on the challah loaves, as we discussed how to do this last week. There's also another option, which is called, our sages call it Chamar Medina. Chamar Medina means what is considered a significant enough drink in the country where you are currently residing. Some would view it very often in our country, Chamar Medina might be viewed as like a beer, but a beer is not wine. One does not make the blessing on wine on a beer, but it's still considered like, a drink. And therefore, there will be the option, again, not the ideal option, but there is an option if for whatever reason you don't have wine to still be making the Kiddush on a drink. Now, this idea of the Chamar Medina, like, for example, the beer, would especially be needed by the Kiddush of the day. The reason there's a difference between Kiddush at night and Kiddush by day is that Kiddush by night, there are blessings. So therefore, it's recognizable one is doing a mitzvah, a commandment. One is saying blessings. But by the Kiddush of the day, there's no blessings. There's verses you say. But in the end of the day, if you didn't say any of those verses, basically, you could say like one line and make the blessing on the wine, and that was your Kiddush. So therefore, if you're not drinking wine, and if you're making it on your challah loaves, it might not even be clear you're making Kiddush. Because what's really the difference? In other words, by night, we don't have a question what's the difference. Because by night, we're making blessings. So we know, yes, wine, no wine. We're still making Kiddush. But by day, because there are no blessings on the Kiddush, just the blessing on the food itself, it might not be discernible that this is Kiddush. And that's why by day specifically, if one doesn't have wine, it's preferable to have, again, what our sages call Chamar Medina, which generally be considered in this country a beer over the loaves of bread. But again, the ideal is not to make Kiddush on beer. The ideal is wine. The ideal is a good wine, and then a wine, and then the beer, and then by day, again, that would be the last ditch recourse, if you have to, over bread. Any questions on that?
Don't some men do it on like hard liquor?
Yeah, hard liquor will be considered Chamar Medina, the same way as a beer.
Is that like also for Havdalah?
Yes, same law for Havdalah.
So
Most people don't do it Havdalah on hard liquor, but yes, in other words, the same way I was saying Chamar Medina, a beer, Chamar Medina could be a glass of vodka.
Right, but I also read, but I wasn't sure, that you could do it on tea. Or you could do it in.
So,
or
so
you
that
could
again
do-
becomes like a fuzzy area of what is Chamar Medina. Again, our sages do not say beer. Our sages do not say vodka. Our sages say what is considered a drink, you know, like a drink in the country you are. Needless to say, nowadays, I could go to Starbucks and spend $6 for a coffee. So that's a drink. So Havdalah, the ceremony we have concluding the Sabbath, is a little more lenient than the Kiddush. So that's why for the Havdalah ceremony, people might make it on tea or coffee, or, I mean, you pay money for these things. Why is that not Chamar Medina? It's already getting into what I call iffy territory. But the beer or the vodka is a little more accepted by all as Chamar Medina. I don't know anyone that makes Havdalah on vodka, but
I've seen in Shul do Kiddush on that. Can you?
But by day, not by night.
Yes, by day.
By day, we're talking about by day.
Can you translate Chamar Medina like?
Chamar Medina means a distinguished drink of the country.
A distinguished drink.
Like a drink that would be considered a real drink of the country. Sorry for the very poor translation, but that's what it means. Something that would be like a real drink in the country. So that's why beer or vodka is a drink. And nowadays there are people that say tea and coffee are also, but I don't think anyone would make Kiddush by Yom on tea or coffee. They would make the Havdalah on tea or coffee, but nobody would do it by Kiddush by day. And nobody really would do any of this stuff for Friday night. Again, so Friday night for sure is going to be wine. By day, it's better the Chamar Medina than the bread. And by the Havdalah, we're most lenient with Chamar Medina, which is why there are many people that their first go-to could be that tea. So not everyone would accept that. Some people do, some people don't. I'm not saying a verdict. If you have a question, ask a rabbi before you make the Havdalah. Any other questions?
I just use red wine. So
yeah,
it just
you're safe
to know what.
Right. Then we switched red wine. We know we're safe.
Right.
Any other questions? Okay, so we will stop at this point. Thank you so much. We all know we just finished chapter 5. We will all remember this next week. Thank you so much for joining. Have a wonderful week.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.